Hello and welcome to the Christians in Science annual conference. This is the first time we've been holding our conference online, and it's a pleasure to welcome you and to say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, indeed, whichever applies to you wherever you're watching in the world today. So a special welcome to you if you're new to Christians in Science, and we hope that you and everyone will enjoy being with us for this week of our conference. Now, you'll be able to find out more about us on our website, but briefly, at Christians in Science, we're a network of mostly professional scientists, but also theologians and philosophers and engineers and school teachers of science, and indeed anyone who's interested in the interface of science and faith. So after each talk in our conference this week, we'll be having a short question and answer session. And so you will be able to send in your questions to the speaker on each day using the comment box at the bottom of your screen, whether you're watching on YouTube or on Facebook. And we'll hope to get your questions answered each day, but if not, don't worry, we'll try to fit them in at our panel discussion on Friday. So if a question occurs to you between now and then, please do send it in and we'll try to get to it on Friday. So now that we're having our conference online, I hope you won't mind me saying or suggesting that since you've saved a little bit of money not having to pay for a train fare to London, that you might feel able to donate towards some of the costs of running the conference and indeed the ongoing costs of running Christians in Science. And you'll be able to give using text, using the details on the screen below here. And they'll also be available on the website where you'll find other means of giving rather than by text. So we'll be very grateful for any donations you feel able to make. Equally, we'll be very grateful also to hear from you any comments you have about our conference this week. And you can send them in anytime during the week. And we'd really like to hear from you, especially if you're new to Christians in Science. And we'll be able to take on board all the suggestions and comments that you make for future reference. So that brings me now to the introduction of our speaker today. And it's a real pleasure to welcome Professor Bob White. Professor White is Professor of Geophysics at Cambridge University. And he's also the director of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion in Cambridge. He's a very distinguished scientist, and we are very pleased also to be able to announce today that Bob will become our president of Christians in Science on the retirement later this year of Professor Sir Colin Humphreys, and we look forward to Bob taking over as our president. Now, Professor White has written extensively on issues related to science and faith, and in particular, the theological implications of natural disasters, amongst other things. And so we are particularly grateful to have him speak to us today on plagues and pandemics, perspectives from science and faith.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure for me to speak to you about a topic which is affecting every single one of us, particularly the COVID pandemic. And I want to talk this afternoon mostly about that, but also about some pandemics in the past and what sort of Christian responses there might be to pandemics like that. And the first thing I want to say really is that a word I heard frequently repeated in the early stages of the pandemic in England was that this was unprecedented. Well, it's true that it's probably unprecedented in our lifetimes, but certainly pandemics and sudden death are something which people have lived with throughout the history of humanity. And I think the shock for us is that it came upon us in a world where we barely think about death. We live as if we're not going to die. We don't even like to think about it. So let me just give you some perspective on the deaths that are caused by other things which are around all the time. Just the common or garden flu killed about 23,000 people in the winter of 2014-15. Now you might know that we have vaccines against that, but we don't always get the right vaccine because we have to get the idea from the southern hemisphere before it hits the northern hemisphere. Globally, there are things which we hardly even notice happening year on year. So tuberculosis kills 1.5 million people every year. Diarrhea kills a similar number, about 1.6 million every year. And shockingly, nearly 500,000 of those are children under 5 years old. And these are things which are largely preventable for quite a small amount of money and just education largely. And yet we live with them day by day. We barely even register that these things are happening. Road deaths, which are completely avoidable, aren't they? Because they're always caused by humans, one way or another, kill 1.3 million people every year. And yet we say, well, we have to have our cars, don't we? That's a really important part of our freedom. So I just wanted to say that to put it into perspective, not to say that the coronavirus pandemic is trivial, but just to put it into perspective of what people around the world have experienced and are experiencing even today, day by day. Second thing I want to say about viruses, we'll probably hear more about this in talks later this week, but I want to say a little bit about them. First of all, they're not living organisms insofar as they can't reproduce on their own. They're just packages of RNA or DNA. They require getting into a host cell and using their mechanisms to reproduce. And at the moment, the only way we can deal with them is to get our body's own immune system to neutralize them. Of course, viruses have a very bad press, but I just want to flag up that they can be useful. Scientists are trying to engineer viruses to kill some of these really difficult bacterial infections, the superbugs that antibiotics can't touch now. These are called bacteriophages, and viruses are rather good at getting at bacteria and killing them. So this might be of direct use to humans. And in fact, many mammals keep viruses going within them, despite the sort of cost of doing that, because they are useful in countering bacterial infections that they might get. Even in humans, it's probably a little known fact that viruses are used and are essential in the placenta in order to get nutrients across from the mother to their baby in the womb. Because viruses are rather good at penetrating cells. Now, normally the placenta is a block between the mother and the baby, but of course you do want to get some things across, like nutrients. And in fact, about 8% of human genome is viral inserts. They've been around forever, and they do have uses as well. Maybe we don't know what all those uses are yet. But of course, they can run amok when a new one invades a human population. Other viral infections that have been around, famously the Spanish flu at the end of the First World War killed 50 million, maybe as many as 100 million people worldwide. It spread around the world pretty fast, not quite so fast as the COVID infection is spreading today, because that moves literally at the speed of a jet airliner, doesn't it? But nevertheless, even in 1918, it spread around the world quite effectively and killed a lot of people. More recently, we've had scares about Ebola, about AIDS, about SARS, about MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. These are all viral infections where viruses are brought into humans, usually from outside humans. I want to just highlight the smallpox, which has been around for a very long time. It's found in Egyptian mummies from the 3rd century BC. And even in my lifetime, in the 20th century, the middle of the 20th century, it killed 300 million people. Huge number of people. Once you got smallpox, you had a 30% chance of dying. It was a wicked, wicked disease. But due to human ingenuity, if you like, and I'll come back to that in a little bit later in this talk, smallpox was completely eradicated officially by May the 8th, 1980, by a very strong program of vaccination, which vaccinated everybody they could get their hands on, and towards the end, tracked down every single case of smallpox. and eradicated it by vaccinating all the people who had been in contact with the person with it. Now it's just kept in a few biosecure places in case it re-erupts. So we have eradicated smallpox. These things can be done. A picture here, which is a ghastly picture of a sufferer with smallpox, a really horrid disease. Now, just briefly, the COVID-19 disease almost certainly jumped from wild animals. One of the things we know about it, which is perhaps unusual in viruses, is that it kills mainly older people and those with underlying health issues. Often diseases kill very young people as well as older people, but in this case, your risk of dying once you catch it increases. It doubles for every 5 to 6 years of age that you are. And so, for instance, if I catch COVID-19, I'm about 250 times more likely to die than my students in the university. But compared to my grandchildren, who so far I've only seen once since February, I'm over 2,000 times more likely to die than they are if I catch it. So that is one of the particularly terrible things about the COVID disease, which we're all conscious of, is that it does attack older people preferentially, and also people with underlying health issues, people from the BAME background, probably because of health issues related to that, though we don't know for sure yet. At present, there's no vaccination. There's about 100 teams around the world working on a vaccine, many different types of vaccine. At the moment, there's no drug treatment against it if you catch it, though gradually medics are getting better at treating you if you do catch it. But basically, the only treatment we have is to keep people alive by keeping the oxygen level high in their bloodstream, just giving them oxygen and keeping people separate from each other, isolation, to prevent them getting it. Here's a graph about the lethality from some early results in Spain. The graph on the right, these are decadal age groups, 0 to 9, 10 to 19, 20 to 29, and so on, as you go down the bars. And it just shows you that in the bottom one, the 90-year-old plus, the lethality of it once you catch it is about 23%. It gets much worse as you get older, as I said just now. Probably the virus jumped from a stable population in probably bats. Horseshoe bats in Southeast Asia and China have over 96% of their genome identical to the coronavirus infection found in humans. So almost certainly that's where it came from. They're okay there. And one of the issues is that they've jumped into humans because we've been pushed into closer contact with wild animals. Probably it came through an intermediate animal. We don't know what that is. Some people have thought it's pangolins. Maybe it was, but it's certainly something. And it seems quite likely that it's been transferred in one of the places like the wet markets in China, where some of them have very poor hygiene. But also there is something I'm not going to talk about today, but there is the whole issue of the way that humans are pushing wild animals into smaller and smaller places. And the effects of climate change too, we could talk about if we had more time, of how that is changing the ranges of wild animals, where wild animals can live. And of course, there's a whole business of eating wild animals for meat in a way which is perhaps not what we're used to doing. Well, let me just talk now about some of the reactions to pandemics before I get specifically onto Christian reactions. These are some that you see very commonly around: fear, people being frightened of it, not surprisingly, because you can't see it, and people apparently get it without realizing it initially. Panic, as a result of that first one, really. Panic, which led to very strange behaviors, didn't it, in the early stages? Panic buying of toilet paper and so on. Corruption, sadly, people taking advantage of the uncertainty and the chaos for selfish gain, and that's a feature, I'm afraid, which happens in every disaster, let alone pandemics. Blame and denial, you will have seen multiple times, and sadly, including by some Christian groups, people who perhaps are not well taught biblically, who will say, well, if you just say these magic words, you'll be protected. Well, of course, God is sovereign, he can protect people, but in general, that's not the way this world works. Blaming people, usually blaming them for something which you personally dislike. It may be their sexual lifestyle or some other thing like that, and saying, well, of course, this is a direct consequence of that. That's why you've got this disease. And again, the Bible, actually, if you dig into it, gives no justification for that sort of response. In fact, if you read the book of Job, you'll see that's what his friends were saying to Job. He's saying, well, you must have done something bad. That's why you're suffering. And he said, no, I know I haven't done anything bad. And in the end, of course, he was justified by God after that. Something which perhaps we're not used to is grief and lament in particular, although lament is very thoroughly present, particularly in the Old Testament. Of course, we feel grief, and we should feel lament about this happening, because it probably didn't have to happen. But on the more positive side, and I should have spent more time on this really, altruism and compassion that we've seen time after time by people giving themselves for others, not just in the frontline services, the nurses and doctors and delivery men and refuse collectors and so on, but also just down your individual street of people looking out for one another. And that is a feature, and it's certainly a feature which ought to be a hallmark of Christians, shouldn't it? Well, let me just talk now for the second half a little bit about theology and science and how that relates to this particular pandemic. I want to make a point first that I think it's a sign of God's goodness to us that he has made a world that's understandable by science, and that understanding can be used for the common good. There's no particular reason, is there, that it might have been, that it was going to be like that. And yet it is like that. It is a world which we can understand, which God has made in such a way and made us in such a way that we can understand it and use it for the common good. Of course, our whole medical care is an outflowing of that. People live much longer. We can look after people better than ever we did before. And that eradication of smallpox I mentioned earlier is a manifestation of that, really. It's a sign of God's goodness that he's made a world we can work in as scientists. That's why I think science is a deeply Christian thing to do. And this was understood really from the very initial time that science, in the way that we know it today, first got going. That was really with the Royal Society being founded in the 1660s. And we still have the charter from that first being set up, the charter from King Charles II, where this is what he said: the Society's studies are to be applied to further promoting by the authority of experiments, the sciences of natural things, the world around us, and of useful arts, actually we would say technology and science now, for two reasons, he said: to the glory of God the Creator, that's the first reason, and secondly, the advantage of the human race. And the founders of the Royal Society had this firmly in their minds, that they wanted to do science so that they could use their understanding of the world around us for the good of humankind. And I think that's an amazing thing. And the sort of whole society's view that science and faith are in conflict is a very recent thing. It certainly wasn't present when it was set up. Certainly the opposite was true. And many of the founding members of the Royal Society, a group of men, and it was all men then, who got together, were very active, believing Christians. And this is what they thought they should do as an outwork of their faith. Now, what some people will say, and you'll hear people say this, is that this pandemic, or equally disasters, something I work on a lot is disasters, earthquakes, volcanoes, that sort of thing. Some people will say, well, that's just nature, isn't it? That's not God. It's just the natural world doing that. It's not God's fault. But actually, as Augustine said in the 4th century, nature is what God does. Nature is what God is doing, another translation of the Latin. So you can't say, well, that's just nature, because that's not God. Because if you have a strong view of God's sovereignty and of his immanence, his presence in this world, then that nature is a manifestation of God's character in some sense. So nature is what God does. And that's why, as I say, being a scientist is a great privilege, because we're investigating God's creation. One last thing I really want to say about science is that it is a transnational thing. And actually, the COVID-19 genome was shared with the international community within weeks. And many of those laboratories working on a vaccine are international. They're groups across academia and industry and across countries very often. And I think that's one of the features of science, that it can bring people together in a way that many other things don't, particularly living as we do in an age of extreme nationalism almost everywhere you work, you look around the world. Well, what about some specifically Christian responses? I've outlined some of the general responses. Let's look at Christian responses. Care for the sick and dying has been a hallmark of Christian responses throughout the ages, really. The first hospices, and indeed the first hospitals, were really founded by Christians, specifically to care for their fellow people. And actions actually speak louder than words. And I think it's an amazing opportunity for Christians, actually, just to get on and do it. Far more effective, probably, than just speaking words about our understanding of theology or whatever. And in fact, this played out in a 3rd century Roman plague, which went right across the Roman Empire. There was a man called Bishop Cyprian in Carthage, who urged Christians to stay in Carthage and help the dying people there, rather than fleeing from Carthage, as anybody who had enough money to do was doing. There were some shocking scenes at the time, where people, if they had relatives who had the plague, they threw them out on the pavement to keep them away from them. Well, Bishop Cyprian turned that on its head, and people noticed afterwards, and I'll say something about that in a minute. But a striking thing about Bishop Cyprian's response was that he'd just been through a whole period of persecution. The Christians had been persecuted, and here they were, turning around and caring for, looking after the very people who'd been persecuting them. And people didn't fail to notice that. Luther said something similar in the 16th century when he remained in Wittenberg rather than fleeing from plague then. And it is a fact which has been shown historically that revivals of Christianity often followed plagues. And I'm sure it's not least because people saw the self-giving of Christians, who of course often died in doing that because they had no more protection from plague than other people. Although also it was the case that Christian communities, because they cared for one another, in many ways came out stronger because they did look after each other in a way that the general populace didn't necessarily do. So care for the sick and dying, sacrificial care for others is part of that. If you've ever been up to Derbyshire, to this little village called Eyam, there's an amazing story there which is really relevant today. But plague came there in 1665, probably on some samples of cloth. Small village of about 800 people. And the leaders of the church, in fact, William Mompesson and another ordained leader, immediately said that, look, we ought to self-isolate the village to prevent this plague spreading to the towns around. And in fact, that is what they did. And as a consequence, about 300 people in the village died, including William Mompesson's own wife. But the plague didn't go anywhere else. So who knows how many people's lives they saved. So that sacrificial care in practice was very clear. One of the other things which this current pandemic is forcing on us, isn't it, is it's forcing us to reevaluate what are the important things in our lives. What values do we hold? What's the purposes of our lives? And that again is a huge Christian opportunity, isn't it? Because while we're going along perfectly happily in our own materialistic way and things don't affect us, it's easy to forget about God, or not even to think about him if you don't know him already. C.S. Lewis put this very well in his little book, The Problem of Pain. He said, God whispers to us in our pleasures, he speaks in our conscience, but he shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And so if nothing else, living through this pandemic is making people reevaluate what's important in their lives. And of course, for many of us, that is our families, our relationships, our friends, and so on. And as I say, this is a huge Christian opportunity, actually, to be present in the community, saying there are reasons that we have for our faith. And it's also shown as part of that, really, the value of community relationships, because the only protection we have at the moment, really, because we haven't got any vaccination, is to isolate ourselves. It's incredibly primitive, isn't it? But that's what lockdown was. We just locked ourselves away, a bit like the village of Eyam did in the 1665 plague. And that isolation has certainly made us realize the value of community relationships, hasn't it? I'm sure it has with you too. Down our street, there's a WhatsApp group. And we live in a street with fairly big houses separated. We barely knew our neighbours, but now we know all of them, all 20 or 30 of them very well. And there's little messages go around every day. You know, anybody wants something from the shop, I'm going, and I can bring it back to those who couldn't go out. Anybody want this doing or that doing? And I found out this is happening at so-and-so. And you might be able to share in that. So isolation has made us realize that we're not individualistic people living on our own, which I'm afraid is, again, the spirit of the age, isn't it? It's not just materialism, but it's me, me, me. I'm important. What I do matters more than anything else. That is not a Christian message. And if nothing else, this pandemic is making us realize that it's not a way to live either. The Apostle Paul put it in Philippians this way. He said, don't look after your own interests, but each of you look out for the interests of others. And of course, Christianity is a deeply relational religion, isn't it? It's relational primarily between us and our Father God through the Lord Jesus. But also, because of that, it's relational between us and our fellow people around us. And also, in fact, relational between us and the creation that God created around us. So of all people, Christians should worry a lot about global climate change, for example, of environmental degradation. And as I say, strangely enough, those things may feed into the current pandemic, the consequences of some of those things. Another thing that the pandemic is leading to is having conversations about death. You might think this is a rather strange thing for me to raise, but actually we don't talk about death. Many of us live as if we're not going to die. I didn't see a dead person until I saw my mother not so many years ago after she had died. We don't live with death in the way that people did generations ago, where it happened within their households. It happened all around them. And because we don't talk about death, we miss out on perhaps the most important part of the gospel, isn't it? That Christ came, he lived in this world, he died, and he rose again in order to bring fullness of life in the new creation for us. And the gospel really is about that redemption, that fullness of life, which is offered us partly in this world, because that life is here already, but supremely in the world to come. And so conversations about death can only be good things. And certainly some secular commentators have said the same thing, that, this is good, it's making us talk about death, because we know that's going to come to every single one of us. So we should talk about it, shouldn't we? And again, as as the Apostle Paul said in Philippians, for me to live is Christ, to die is gain. That was exactly his point. Now, just going back to Bishop Cyprian, something else he said when he was giving a famous sermon to his followers, the other Christians in Carthage there, a sermon which is still preserved, and you can read it on the internet. This is what he said. He said, if you truly believe in God, why do you, who are destined to be with Christ and are secure in the promise of the Lord, not rejoice that you are called to Christ and be glad that you are free from the devil? The same point as Paul was making, really. He couldn't decide whether it was better to live in this world or to die because he'd be with Christ. So conversations about death, although you may think that's strange, I think they might be very significant. And we have an opening as Christians to do that. You might remember in the New Testament, there was an occasion when people came to Jesus when 18 people had been killed, when a tower in Siloam fell down and it killed them. And they wanted to know whose fault it was, really. These people, were they sinful? Or did their parents or their grandparents sin? Is that why they died? And Jesus's answer was, I think, fascinating, because he turned that question on its head and pointed at a very different thing instead. Jesus said, do you think that those who died were worse offenders than all the others who lived in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. Now, of course, we know that we're all going to die, but what he was pointing to was there was something much more important than physical life and death, which is the spiritual life we have with Jesus if we repent and turn to him. Unless you repent and turn back to Christ, you're going to die out of relationship with God, which is the worst thing you can imagine that would happen. And so these thoughts have been around for a long time. Well, another thing about COVID is that it's exposed starkly the inequities and injustices of our current practices. The fact that people who die are disproportionately the poor in health, the poor in finances. Because as in all disasters, although the COVID-19 pandemic can affect anyone, it's the poor and the disadvantaged who suffer most. And the biblical perspective is that disasters occur not because it's just something inbuilt into nature, but because humankind has failed to care for and to rule properly this creation that God has made. Creation which he said in the very first chapter of the Bible was very good when he sat back and looked at everything he'd made. Our failure to care for it and to properly look after it, to rule over it, is really a definition of sin. We've said, I want to do it my way, not yours, haven't we? In that parody of the Lord's Prayer, that not your will be done, but my will be done. And that's what's basically has gone wrong with this world. Now, I said before, it is quite proper to feel grief. Of course it is, for people who are suffering and dying, and to lament to God that this is the case, because this is not the way the world is meant to be. It's not the way it will be in the new creation, where there will be no more tears or crying or mourning. But it is the way it is because of human sinfulness, as I just said, in all its manifestations. And the COVID-19 is just the latest manifestation of that. Now, I want to finish not on those sort of miserable notes, if you like, although they're real and true, but on a note for hope for the future, because this surely is the heart of the Christian gospel, that Christians do have hope for the future. That is what the gospel is, the good news. And as Paul said in Romans, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. And that is because we know that in that new creation, the world will be the way it was meant to be, without any of that human sinfulness, which is marring it at the moment, is putting it out of kilter, if you like, despoiling it. It's not the way it was meant to be, because God gave humans free will, and we chose to use that free will, every single one of us, to rebel against him. And we're seeing consequences of that every day in our lives, don't we? So hope for the future is a great message that Christians can bring to this whole business. And we should be. What a great opportunity to talk about the hope the Christian faith brings. And I was very struck recently listening to the something that Francis Collins said, which I'll come to in a minute. But that hope for the future, again, Paul talked about. He said, we know that the whole creation has been groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time. Now, I have got children, and I watched my wife go through childbirth, but I didn't go through it myself, of course. And it is a very painful thing. But amazingly, as soon as that new child is in their arms, a lot of that pain disappears behind them with the joy of that new child. And that's the sort of picture that Paul is giving, that creation is groaning now because things are not right. But that birth is coming, it's guaranteed, we know it is. And then that will be put behind us. And then when that happens, there'll be a new heaven and a new earth, no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I'm making everything new. God said, I'm not going to make all new things. I'm going to make everything new again. I'm going to clean it up, remove sin from this world, and come down and live with you in this world in the way it was meant to be. And this is a comment from Francis Collins that I mentioned just now. He said this on an interview that I heard on the radio recently. The only thing that spreads faster than a virus is hope. So what a great opportunity for Christians, isn't it, to spread that hope around, the hope that we have in the Lord Jesus. I've just put up a book which explores some of these issues, not in the particular circumstance of COVID-19, but of other disasters which the world experiences all the time. So I look forward to your questions and an opportunity to discuss some of these deep issues further. These are not trivial issues, and they deeply reach into our psyches, of course, and our experiences, particularly for those of us who have known friends and close relations who have died. But it is the way the world is, and the world is this way because of human failings, human sinfulness. So as I say, this is a great opportunity for Christians to point to the Lord Jesus, to point to the new creation that is to come. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing some of your comments and questions.
Well, thank you, Bob. That was a really educational and far-ranging talk, and thank you for covering so much ground and raising some very important questions with us. So we have a number of questions that have come in, and perhaps we could start with one or two more technical ones before we get on to the perhaps deeper ones. One of the questions asks about, and this may be something that will come up after tomorrow's talk on virology, but the question is asked, what is it about this particular COVID disease that makes older people particularly vulnerable?
Yes, well, I might just defer most of that answer till tomorrow. As you said, it's a good reason to tune in at the same time tomorrow,
yeah.
To hear somebody who's expert in that. I'm just a rock basher, as you know. But it is clear that COVID particularly attacks the lungs. It may get into the alveoli and attack the surface tension, and that's why people have such difficulty breathing. And that's why you need to keep pumping oxygen into people through their lungs. Older people, of course, suffer from respiratory problems more readily than younger people. So it's evidently related to that. That's also, of course, why we're wearing masks, because it can be spread that way through just from your lungs and from the upper tract into the air. So that's important. And older people are more vulnerable to flu and diseases like that. But it is very striking with this that it is preferentially, and it's statistically it's really clear. If you plot mortality or the likelihood of dying once you have it against age on a log plot, it's a straight line, which means it doubles every 5 to 6 years, something like that. And it is unusual in that respect. I think many others attack very small children as well, but for some reason they are much more resilient. So there's hope with schools going back that, you know, they won't suffer so much. The only worry there is that there'll be vectors bringing it home to parents and grandparents. That's a different issue. But we really don't know the epidemiology of it that well, because it's a very recent thing. It's hit us very hard and very suddenly. So I'm sure these things will be worked out more as we investigate it more.
Yeah, I think there's some issue with older people's immune system not being as responsive as it is when you're younger. And that may be also another factor, but perhaps Miriam will be able to elaborate more for us tomorrow.
That may well be the case, although I think one of the side issues has been that some people's immune system has kicked in too hard and then it starts destroying other organs as well. So, you know, it's a pretty delicate balance, isn't it?
Yes. So there's another question related to viruses, and which is that given that the smallpox virus has been eradicated from the planet, but yet some samples of it are being stored. So why are we keeping the smallpox virus at all? Why don't we just get rid of it totally?
Well, we think it's been eradicated, but hey, say there is something somewhere and it burst upon us, we'd have the same problem as we have right now with COVID. I mean, it makes sense to keep a few samples in case we have to ramp up vaccines and treatments for it again. And no doubt, you know, at this distance from the original vaccine, we'd make better ones, I expect. I mean, it's the same reason as people have reconstructed the virus from the 1918 flu epidemic, which killed at least 50 million people. There weren't any vaccinations then, and the only reason it died out was because it mutated, and it died out naturally eventually. But it is worth keeping some copies so that we might be able to build treatment for it or vaccination against it if that became necessary. So it makes good sense. And you know, some organisms can survive for long periods without us knowing it. So that's you know, we got DNA from woolly mammoths that were found in Siberia from 10,000 years ago, thousands of years ago anyway. So I think that's the reason. But people are being pretty careful about biosecurity, I hope. I'm pretty sure they are in where they keep them. Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned in your talk about our God-given ability to understand the world around us, and using that understanding, we're able to come up with cures for various diseases, and you know, we can predict how things are going to work to some degree. But is finding something that works to heal something the same as understanding it?
You mean you could use an old wives' tale of how to cure headaches or something, and if it works, that's fine? Is that the sort of thing you mean?
Well, I'm trying to interpret what the questioner means. I think perhaps he's saying that in terms of finding drugs that work, sometimes it's kind of hit and miss approach to finding something that works, and we will use it if it works, even if we don't fully understand how it works. And that may apply to our approach to many things, where we find something that works, but we don't have a deep understanding of exactly how it's working and what's actually going on.
Yeah, I'm absolutely sure that's the case. And if you talk to medics, it's much more of an art than we give credence for. We kind of think that it's our right to be cured of absolutely anything, from a sore toe to cancer to anything. But I think if you talk to practicing medics, it is an art, and they try things, and some work and some don't, and some work with some people and some don't. So I think to that extent, yeah, I mean, the number one priority is to find some treatment which helps, which is sort of the phase we've been in, isn't it? You know, pumping oxygen into people, finding ways of positive pressure to keep the oxygen level up, and incubating people in the extreme and getting those in. And there are some medicines people have tried which seem to not be a cure, but they seem to make the disease a bit less aggressive, maybe, that you might recover in a few days earlier. Look at remdesivir and things like that. So I think it's quite correct that some of these medicines work, and we don't understand why. But I mean, hopefully we will understand why, and then we can target treatments much better. Well, target vaccinations to prevent it, target treatments to address it if you do get it much more specifically and much more accurately. So that is the hope. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think that certainly having some understanding, as you explained, about what a virus is and how it reproduces is an important step in designing treatments and so on. And also, I know there are chemists who are working very hard on designer drugs, trying to actually tailor drugs and shapes of molecules to fit specific roles in treatment. So that's a kind of understanding, I would say.
Yes. Oh, absolutely, indeed.
Yeah.
And we've moved incredibly fast. I mean, I was reading, there's a great book called Pale Rider, if you want to read about the 1918 pandemic from flu. And, in 1918, they didn't even have a good germ theory of how these things transmitted. It's only 100 years old that we've understood about germs and such like. Didn't know about viruses then. So the rate of human understanding is phenomenal when you step back a bit and see how it's happening. And as I say, I think that's part of God's his grace to us, his general grace to humankind, that we can do these things and we can understand them. So
there's another question just asking a bit of information here. Can you direct us to where we could find out more information on bacteriophages and the viruses in the placenta, that kind of thing?
There is an article which I found, and I can send that to you. I haven't got it to hand at the moment, an academic article, but I'm sure you'll hear more about this tomorrow anyway.
Right.
In the next talk, and actually I expect she's listening, so she can actually, this is a good cue for her. So okay. I'm going to pass on directly to her, and she can talk about that tomorrow.
Okay. So can I raise another sort of more theological question, and that is that you spoke about mankind being fallen, and our response to the world around us has been self-centered rather than God-centered. But some Christian people talk also in terms of the world being fallen, that the world has actually been changed from what God had originally made it because of our sin. So to what extent do you think the world has been changed by our sin, and how much is it just our relationship with the world that God has made as good that is affected? So in other words, what do you mean by fallen?
Yes, I do indeed mean the latter, that it's our relationship to God which is broken, and that affects our relationship with his creation as well, which is broken. And so, and actually you see that in the very first chapters of Genesis, where when Adam and Eve had to leave the garden, then childbirth became more painful. It was painful before, it became more painful. It became more of a struggle to grow food. I mean, you had to work hard at it before, but it became a struggle because you didn't have that sort of understanding relationship with the world you're living in quite the same way. So there's absolutely no evidence that the physical nature of the world changed when humans came into it. And I'm a geologist, so I look at old rocks and so on, and it's quite clear there were earthquakes way before humans ever existed on this earth. There were volcanoes, there were floods, there were catastrophic floods and so on way before humans lived. So I know some people think that earthquakes and floods and volcanoes are a result of the fall of humans turning themselves against God, but there's absolutely no evidence of that. And in fact, you wouldn't expect evidence of that, because all those things I mentioned, floods and volcanoes, are what make this world a fertile place where humans can thrive and live. If we didn't have them, this would be a barren, sterile place, which I could talk about in more length. But these are part of the natural processes. Just as I say, viruses are part of the natural processes on Earth. They've been around for billions of years. And it's when we interact badly with them that things go wrong. So in that sense, the world is not fallen. But the world is suffering from, if you like, misrule by humans. And, at a trivial level, you can see that by despoliation of beautiful natural places which have been, spoiled by strip mining and other things. But on a more intricate level as well, the way that we're changing the climate and so on, and changing the habitats where wildlife can live, how we're causing mass extinctions of wild creatures at an unprecedented level almost by our activities. So in that sense, and I think that's what the Bible means when it says that the whole creation is groaning and waiting for the second coming, if you like, waiting for the renewal that we're promised. So not the world itself, although it is suffering from human, if you can see the distinction.
Right, sure. And maybe something we can explore a little bit more depth in our panel at the end of the week. So I think we probably will wind up our questions at that point in time. And let me just say thank you to Bob again for a wonderful talk, and also to the folk who sent in questions that have helped us kind of fill out some of the other things that you raised. And that really adds value to these sessions. So please keep the questions coming in. So before we say goodbye to Bob, thank you, Bob, and before we say goodbye to everybody out there, I hope you won't mind if I just remind you of the opportunity that we would like to give you to donate to Christians in Science, not just to help cover the costs of the conference, but for our ongoing work. And you can give by text using the information on the screen. And you can also find these details on the website and on screen at the end of the session today. Also, please, we'd be very grateful if you do send in your feedback form and let us know any comments you have on our conference today and during the week. We'd really love to hear from you. You can find the feedback form in the video description on YouTube channel, or also on social media, and indeed on our website. So please do let us know what you think about how the conference has been going for you. Remember also, you can follow Christians in Science in general on social media, Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And you can also, of course, find out more about us on the website, www.cis.org.uk. So thank you again for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow when we'll be having Dr. Miriam Schilling, who'll be speaking about the place of viruses in God's creation. Goodbye.